They said the cold that night would kill anyone left outside for more than 30 minutes, and yet Emily Carter stood there, barefoot on frozen stone, 8 months pregnant, staring at the door that had just closed on her like she never existed, the wind cutting through her thin dress as snow gathered at her feet, each breath turning sharp and visible in the air while inside that mansion, warm lights glowed and laughter echoed. A celebration already beginning without her, because 6 hours earlier, Emily had signed the divorce papers that ended a marriage she once believed was unbreakable, her hand trembling only once before she forced herself to finish, while across the table Daniel Whitmore, billionaire, polished, untouchable, didn't hesitate at all. He signed his name like it was just another contract, not the life of the woman carrying his child, not the years she gave up for him, not the quiet sacrifices no one ever saw, and when it was done, when the final page slid across that glass table, he didn't look at her, not even once. Instead, his phone lit up with a message, a name Emily already knew, Vanessa, the woman who had been waiting in the next room, the woman who would wear white tonight in the same house Emily once called home. And that was the moment everything shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, irreversible break, because Daniel stood up, adjusted his cufflinks, and told her she needed to leave. No explanation, no argument, just a calm, cold instruction as if she were a guest overstaying her welcome. And when Emily hesitated, one hand instinctively resting on her belly as the baby moved gently inside her, he walked to the door, opened it, and let the winter air rush in, the temperature dropping instantly, a silent message that needed no words. And so she stepped forward, slowly, carefully, because at that moment she still believed this was temporary. That something would stop him, that he would say her name, that he would remember who she was to him. But he didn't. The door closed behind her with a final, echoing sound, and the lock clicked, sealing her out while sealing his fate in a way he couldn't possibly understand yet, because what Daniel Whitmore didn't know, what no one inside that house celebrating his new beginning could see, was that the woman he left standing in 20-degree weather, alone and forgotten, was not as powerless as she seemed. And before this night was over, before the music faded and the guests went home, Emily Carter would walk back through those doors, not as the woman he discarded, but as the one person capable of taking everything from him without raising her voice, without breaking a single rule, and without ever needing him again. Emily did not scream and she did not pound on the door because something inside her had already gone quiet in a way that felt more dangerous than panic, her fingers curling slightly against the frozen railing beside the steps as she tried to steady her breathing, each inhale sharp and controlled, each exhale a thin cloud disappearing into the night, while the wind carried faint music from inside the house. A piano melody layered with laughter that did not belong to her anymore, and for a moment she closed her eyes, not to give up but to remember, because just 2 years ago she had walked through those same doors wearing a simple ivory dress, not expensive, not flashy, but chosen carefully because Daniel had once told her he admired elegance over extravagance, and she believed him. She believed all of it, the promises, the future. The idea that she was building something real with a man who seemed so certain, so stable, so different from the chaos she had grown up around, and that belief had cost her everything, her career, her independence, even her voice in small ways she had not noticed until they were gone, because Daniel did not take things from her all at once, he reshaped them, slowly, carefully, until her world revolved entirely around his. And now, standing outside in 20-degree weather, she understood that what felt like security had always been control, and what felt like love had always come with conditions she had never agreed to but somehow accepted anyway. The baby moved again, a small, steady reminder that she was not alone, and Emily placed both hands gently over her belly, grounding herself, focusing on that quiet strength instead of the cold seeping through her skin, because she knew she could not stay here much longer, not like this, not without risking something she refused to lose. And yet her feet did not move immediately, as if part of her still needed to witness the truth fully before walking away, the truth that inside that house, Daniel Whitmore was not thinking about her at all. He was moving forward exactly as planned, greeting guests, checking details, preparing to stand beside another woman under lights that would make everything look perfect, and that thought should have broken her, but it did not anymore. Instead, it settled into something clearer, something sharper, a kind of understanding that did not need emotion to be real, because this was not sudden, not really. The signs had been there in the late nights, the cancelled plans, the subtle shifts in tone. The way he stopped asking her opinion and started informing her of decisions, and the messages, always the messages, brief, hidden, easily dismissed until they were impossible to ignore. Vanessa had not appeared out of nowhere. She had been part of the picture long before Emily allowed herself to see it, and now she was stepping into the life Emily had built, wearing it like it had always belonged to her. But there was one thing Vanessa did not understand and one thing Daniel had completely overlooked, and that was the quiet, deliberate way Emily had handled everything leading up to this night. Because while they believed she was naive, dependent, easy to replace, Emily had been paying attention in her own way, learning the structure of Daniel's world, the decisions he made, the deals he closed, the signatures that mattered and the ones that were just formalities, and there were things he never thought to question, documents he assumed were routine, approvals he signed without hesitation because he trusted the system he built. And Emily had been part of that system longer than anyone realized, her name appearing where it needed to, her presence subtle but real, not as a figurehead, not as decoration, but as something far more permanent. And as the wind picked up again, brushing snow across the stone like a warning, Emily opened her eyes and looked back at the door one last time, not with hope, not with regret, but with a calm certainty that changed everything, because this was not the end of her story, it was the moment it finally became hers, and somewhere in the distance, headlights began to cut through the dark, slow at first, then closer, illuminating the path ahead in a way that felt less like rescue and more like the beginning of something Daniel Whitmore would never see coming. The headlights slowed as they approached, cutting clean lines through the swirling snow until the vehicle came to a quiet stop just a few feet away from Emily, the engine still running, warm light spilling from inside onto the frozen ground like an invitation she had not expected, and for a second she did not move, not because she was afraid but because she had learned that moments like this mattered, the pause before everything changed, the breathe before a decision that could not be undone. And then the driver's door opened, steady, controlled, and a man stepped out, tall, composed, his coat catching the wind without urgency, as if the cold had no authority over him at all, his gaze finding Emily immediately, not with surprise, not with pity, but with recognition that felt deliberate, almost calculated, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, carrying just enough warmth to cut through the air without breaking it. He said her name like he had been expecting to find her. Here, Emily Carter, and that alone was enough to shift something deep inside her because this was not chance, this was not coincidence, this was a moment that had been building long before she stepped into the snow. She studied him carefully, her mind still sharp despite the cold, searching for memory, for context, for anything that explained why a stranger would know her name on a night when she had been erased from her own life. And then it came back to her, not as a face she knew but as a name she had seen, repeatedly, in documents Daniel never thought she understood, in reports he left open, in conversations he dismissed when she entered the room. Alexander Hayes, the one competitor Daniel never underestimated, the one name that always changed his tone, and now that name stood in front of her, real, present, offering something she had not asked for but suddenly needed. He did not ask if she was all right because he could see the answer. He did not waste time on sympathy because he knew it would not serve her. Instead, he simply opened the passenger door and said, "You should not be standing out here, not tonight. Not like this." And there was something in the way he said it that made it clear this was not about kindness, it was about precision, about timing, about understanding exactly what this moment meant. Emily hesitated only briefly before stepping forward, her movements careful, deliberate, each step pulling her away from the version of herself that had been left behind and towards something she had not yet defined. The warmth inside the car wrapped around her instantly, a sharp contrast to the cold she had just endured, and as she settled into the seat, closing the door behind her, the outside world fell quiet in a way that felt almost unreal, like the snow, the house, the music had all been part of something distant, something already fading. Alexander returned to the driver's side, and as the car began to move, slow at first, then steady, he did not look at her right away. giving her space that felt intentional, respectful in a way she had not experienced in a long time. And when he finally spoke, it was not a question, it was a statement that carried more weight than anything Daniel had said all night. He said, "You know this does not end here," and Emily turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze for the first time with a clarity that had nothing to do with the situation and everything to do with who she had become in the last few hours, because she didn't know, she had known the moment the door closed, the moment the lock clicked. The moment she realized that everything she thought she was losing had already been taken long before tonight, and now there was nothing left to protect except the truth, Alexander continued, his tone steady, revealing just enough to confirm what she had already begun to understand. He said, "Daniel believes he controls every outcome because he signs every decision, but signatures mean nothing if you do not know what you are signing." And that was when Emily allowed herself the smallest shift in expression, not a smile, not relief, but recognition, because she had seen those documents. She had watched those signatures, she had been there in the background where no one thought to look, and Alexander knew it, he had always known it. The car turned onto a main road, the lights of the mansion fading behind them. And ahead, the city stretched out, bright, alive, indifferent to what had just happened. But Emily was no longer thinking about what she had lost, she was thinking about what Daniel had just given away without realizing it, and as the car moved forward into the night, one thing became absolutely certain. By the time the music stopped and the last glass was raised inside that house, the balance of power would no longer belong to the man who believed he had ended her story. The city lights reflected across the windshield in long, shifting lines as the car moved forward, each block carrying Emily further away from the version of her life that had ended less than an hour ago, and yet nothing about her felt distant or disconnected. In fact, everything felt sharper, clearer, as if the cold had stripped away every illusion she had been holding on to, leaving only what was real, and what was real was this. She was no longer reacting, she was choosing, and that difference mattered more than anything Daniel had ever controlled. Alexander adjusted the temperature inside the car without asking, the warmth steady now, deliberate, like everything else about him, and when he finally spoke again his voice carried a tone that was neither comforting nor commanding. It was simply precise. He said, "Daniel filed those documents this morning, not just the divorce, but the transfer agreements tied to your name." And Emily's eyes shifted slightly, not surprised, not confused, but focused. Because she understood exactly what he was referring to, the stack of papers she had been asked to sign over the past 6 months, presented as routine, positioned as necessary for restructuring, always urgent, always framed as something that would make things easier, safer, more efficient, and she had signed them, every single one, not because she trusted Daniel blindly, but because she had read them in her own way, not just the language but the patterns, the repetitions, the subtle inconsistencies that did not align with the explanations she was given, and she had asked questions, quiet ones, careful ones. The kind that did not raise suspicion but gave her enough information to see what he thought she could not. And what she saw was this: Daniel had built his empire on the assumption that control meant ownership, that if his name appeared at the top, everything beneath it belonged to him. But systems do not work that way, not entirely. And somewhere between the clauses and the signatures, between the assets and the approvals, Emily Carter had become something he did not account for, not a placeholder, not a dependent, but a fixed point in the structure he believed he fully understood. Alexander continued, his eyes still on the road. He said he thinks tonight is clean, that everything is finalized, that there are no loose ends, and for the first time since she stepped into the car, Emily allowed herself to speak, her voice steady, controlled. She said he never checks what he does not expect to change, and that was the truth of it. Daniel had never expected her to change, not really. He had built his expectations around the version of her that fit into his world, the version that adapted, that supported, that stayed within the lines he defined, and when she stepped outside of that, even slightly, he did not adjust, he dismissed, and that dismissal had created a gap, a small one at first, almost invisible, but over time it widened into something far more significant, something that now existed between what he believed and what was actually true. The car turned into a private drive. The kind that did not appear on maps. leading toward a building that stood quiet and controlled against the night, its glass exterior reflecting the city like a mirror that only revealed what it chose to show. Alexander slowed to a stop and the engine softened, the world outside calm, contained, and he finally looked at her directly, his expression unchanged, but his words carrying the weight of everything that was about to follow. He said, "You have 2 hours before he stands in front of everyone and makes it official. 2 hours before he locks his version of the story in place." And Emily stepped out of the car without hesitation, the cold no longer reaching her the same way it had before. Because now it was no longer something happening to her, it was something she had already moved through, and as she walked toward the entrance, the doors opening before she even reached them, she understood exactly what those 2 hours meant. Not a chance to react, not a chance to recover, but a window, precise, narrow, and entirely hers, because Daniel Whitmore believed he had already ended everything that mattered, and in doing so, he had created the one condition he could never control, a moment where he would not be looking. And in that moment, Emily Carter would decide exactly what remained standing. When he finally did, the doors closed behind Emily with a soft, controlled sound that felt nothing like the one that had locked her out earlier, and for the first time that night, the environment around her responded to her presence instead of rejecting it. The air inside warm but not overwhelming, the lighting deliberate, clean, revealing rather than hiding. And she did not pause to take it in because she already understood what this place was, not just a building but a system. One that valued precision, structure, and awareness, everything Daniel's world pretended to be but never truly was, and as she moved forward, her steps steady despite everything her body had just endured, people appeared without needing to be called, not rushing, not questioning, simply aligning with the moment as if it had already been anticipated. A woman approached with a coat that fit Emily perfectly, as if it had been chosen in advance, and that detail did not go unnoticed, because nothing here felt accidental, everything felt prepared, and that realization confirmed what Emily had already begun to understand. This was not rescue, this was positioning, and Alexander had not found her by chance. He had been waiting for the moment when she would no longer belong to Daniel's narrative, when she would become something independent of it, and now that moment had arrived. He walked beside her without speaking for several seconds, allowing the silence to settle into something productive rather than uncertain, and when they entered a private room lined with glass panels that overlooked the city, he placed a single folder on the table. Not dramatically, not forcefully, just enough to shift the focus of the entire space, and Emily's attention moved to it immediately, not with hesitation but with recognition, because she knew what it represented before opening it, and when she did, the contents confirmed everything she had suspected and more. Documents, structured cleanly, each page precise, each signature positioned exactly where it needed to be, her name appearing not as an afterthought but as a constant, a fixed element across multiple layers of ownership and control. And as she turned each page, the pattern became undeniable. The assets Daniel believed he had secured, the transfers he believed were final, the authority he believed he held, all of it intersected with her in ways he had never accounted for. And Alexander spoke then, his voice quiet but exact. He said, "You were never removed from the system, he just believed you were," and that single sentence reframed everything. Because it was not about what Daniel had taken from her, it was about what he had failed to remove, what he had overlooked because he did not consider her capable of holding it, and that assumption had created the one vulnerability he could not see. Emily closed the folder slowly, not out of uncertainty but out of control, because she understood now that this was not about proving anything, it was about timing, about using exactly what was already in place at the exact moment it would matter most. And she looked up at Alexander, her expression calm, focused, not asking what to do but confirming what she had already decided, and he nodded once, not as approval but as alignment, because this was not his move, it was hers, and he knew it. He said, "The ceremony starts in 90 minutes, the contracts finalize when he signs in front of witnesses." And Emily responded without hesitation, her voice steady, clear. She said, "Then we let him sign." Because that was the point Daniel had never understood. Control is not about stopping something from happening, it is about choosing when it does. And as the room remained quiet around them, the city lights reflecting in the glass like 1,000 silent witnesses. Emily Carter stood there no longer as someone recovering from what had been done to her, but as someone preparing to redefine the outcome entirely. And somewhere across the city, in a house filled with music and certainty, Daniel Whitmore continued moving forward, unaware that every step he took was leading him directly into a moment he would not be able to undo. Time did not slow down, it sharpened, every minute inside that room carrying weight. Every second moving with intention as Emily stood in front of the mirror, not to admire what she saw but to confirm it. The woman reflected back at her was not the one who had been standing in the snow less than 2 hours ago. That version had been stripped away, piece by piece, until only clarity remained, and clarity did not need comfort, it needed direction. The coat had been replaced with something structured, clean lines, neutral tones, nothing loud, nothing decorative, just presence, because tonight was not about being seen. It was about being undeniable, and behind her the quiet movement of staff continued. Efficient, discreet, aligning everything without interrupting the focus of the moment. Alexander remained near the window, watching the city, not because he needed to but because he understood the rhythm of what was unfolding. He did not offer advice, he did not give instructions, because he knew Emily was already past the point of needing either. Instead he spoke only when it mattered, his voice low, measured. He said once he signs in front of witnesses, the transfer locks into public record. And Emily adjusted the sleeve of her coat slightly. Her movements precise, controlled. She said then we let him complete it exactly as planned, because that was the center of everything now, not stopping Daniel, not interrupting him, but allowing him to finalize the very structure that would expose what he had overlooked. And that realization carried a quiet power that did not need to be expressed. It simply existed, steady, undeniable. The folder rested on the table beside her, unchanged, untouched since she closed it. Because she did not need to review it again, she already knew what it contained. Not just the documents but the leverage, the alignment, the reality that had been sitting beneath the surface of Daniel's decisions for months, waiting for the exact moment when it would matter, and that moment was now approaching with absolute precision. A soft knock sounded at the door, not urgent, not hesitant, and when it opened a man stepped inside, older, composed, his presence carrying the kind of authority that did not need introduction. He placed a small envelope on the table beside the folder and spoke with quiet certainty. He said everything is prepared, legal confirmation is ready. The moment it is presented, and Emily's gaze moved to the envelope briefly before returning to him. She did not ask what was inside because she already understood its purpose. This was not new information. This was validation, the final piece that ensured there would be no confusion when the time came, no room for interpretation, no delay. And that mattered, not for impact but for clarity. Because tonight was not about creating chaos, it was about revealing order, the kind of order Daniel had believed he controlled but had never fully understood. The man stepped back without waiting for acknowledgement, leaving the room as quietly as he entered, and the silence that followed felt complete. Not empty but settled, as if everything that needed to be in place already was. Emily reached for the envelope then, opening it with steady hands, her eyes scanning the contents quickly, confirming what she already expected. Signatures, confirmations, official seals, each one aligning with the documents in the folder, each one reinforcing the same truth, that Daniel Whitmore had built his empire on a foundation he never fully examined. And tonight he would reinforce that foundation himself in front of witnesses, cameras, and contracts that would make it permanent. She closed the envelope and placed it beside the folder, not stacking them, not hiding them, simply placing them where they belong, visible, accessible, ready. Alexander turned from the window then, his gaze meeting hers with a quiet understanding that did not require explanation. He said the car will be ready in 10 minutes, and Emily nodded once. Not because she needed confirmation but because she had already moved past the point of hesitation. This was not about whether she would go back, it was about how, and more importantly when. And as the final minutes began to count down, the distance between where she stood now and where Daniel believed she was grew wider with every passing second, because in his world she had already disappeared, already been replaced, already been removed from the outcome he was preparing to finalize. And that assumption would be the one thing he could not correct, not when the doors Opened, not when the music paused, not when every eye in the room turned toward the one presence he had already dismissed, and as Emily took one final look at the reflection in front of her, not to question it but to confirm it, there was no trace of uncertainty left. Only intention, only timing, only the quiet certainty that before this night ended, everything Daniel believed to be secure would no longer belong to him. The car moved through the city with quiet precision, each turn calculated, each streetlight passing like a countdown that no one else could hear, and Emily sat in the back seat with the folder resting beside her, not holding it tightly, not guarding it, because what it represented did not require protection anymore, it required timing, and that timing was now unfolding exactly as it needed to. Outside the window the world continued as if nothing had shifted, restaurants still open, people still laughing, traffic moving in steady lines, unaware that within the next hour, one of the most controlled men in that city would lose control in a way he had never prepared for, and inside the car there was no urgency, no panic, only a calm, deliberate focus that made everything feel inevitable. Alexander did not speak for several minutes, allowing the silence to hold its purpose, and when he finally did, his voice was low, steady. He said, "Once we arrive, you will not need to say much," and Emily's gaze remained forward, her reflection faint in the glass. She said, "I know," because she did. This was never about confrontation, never about emotion, it was about precision. About placing the right truth in the right moment, and letting it do exactly what it was designed to do. The car slowed as they approached the long drive leading back to the house, the same house that had closed its doors on her. But now it looked different, not because it had changed, but because she had. The lights were brighter, the music clearer, the atmosphere filled with expectation, guests arriving, staff moving with purpose, everything aligned around a moment Daniel believed would confirm his control, and that belief made it easier, not harder. Because people are most vulnerable when they think everything is already secured. The car came to a smooth stop just beyond the main entrance, not directly in front, not drawing attention, just enough distance to observe without interrupting, and Emily stepped out slowly, her movements composed, measured, as if she had always intended to arrive this way. The cold air touched her again, but it no longer held the same weight, it no longer defined the moment, it simply existed. And she moved through it without hesitation, the path ahead lit softly, leading toward the entrance where guests were being welcomed, their attention focused inward, toward the event, toward the celebration, not toward the quiet figure approaching from the side. And that was exactly as it needed to be, because timing is not just about when something happens, it is about when it is noticed. Emily reached the edge of the gathering and paused for just a second, not out of uncertainty but out of awareness. Observing the rhythm of the room, the positioning of people, the flow of attention, identifying the exact point where everything converged, and inside, through the open doors, she could see him, Daniel Whitmore, standing near the center, composed, confident, speaking with guests as if nothing had been disrupted, as if the past few hours had unfolded exactly according to his design. Vanessa beside him, perfectly aligned with the image he wanted to present, polished, assured, unaware that the structure supporting that image was already shifting beneath her feet, and for a moment, just a brief one, Emily watched them, not with anger, not with regret, but with a clarity that felt almost distant, because this was no longer personal in the way it once had been. This was structural, this was inevitable, this was the outcome of choices made long before tonight. And then she stepped forward, crossing the threshold not as someone returning, but as someone arriving. And the shift was immediate, subtle at first, a few heads turning, a few conversations pausing, a change in energy that moved through the room without needing explanation, because presence does not ask for attention. It commands it quietly. And as Emily moved further inside, the distance between her and Daniel closing with each step, the room adjusted around her, not dramatically, not abruptly, but enough for the moment to take shape, enough for the illusion to begin to crack. And somewhere in that space, without raising her voice, without breaking her pace, Emily Carter carried everything she needed to redefine the outcome of the night, and Daniel Whitmore, standing exactly where he believed he should be, had no idea that the next few minutes would be the only ones that truly mattered. The shift in the room did not happen all at once, it moved like a ripple, subtle, controlled, beginning at the edges where a few conversations paused and eyes turned not out of curiosity but out of instinct, because something about Emily's presence did not align with the narrative that had already been accepted, and as she stepped further into the light, the contrast became undeniable. Not because she demanded attention, but because she carried certainty, and certainty does not blend in, it reframes everything around it. Daniel noticed it a second later, not immediately, not until the pattern of the room changed just enough to interrupt his rhythm. His voice paused mid-sentence, his expression adjusting with the precision of someone trained to maintain control, and when his eyes found her, the reaction was not loud, not dramatic, it was a single moment of stillness that revealed more than any visible response could have, because in that instant, something did not make sense to him, not the timing, not the presence. Not the fact that the version of her he believed he had already removed was now standing in front of him, composed, unshaken, entirely outside the outcome he had prepared. Vanessa turned as well, her expression shifting more quickly, confusion first, then calculation, because she understood the stakes of perception even if she did not yet understand the structure beneath it, and the room followed their attention, conversations dissolving into quiet observation as the center of the night realigned itself without needing to be announced. Emily stopped just within the main space, not too close, not too distant, exactly where she needed to be. Seen without interrupting the flow prematurely, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, carrying without effort. She said, "Daniel, you should finish what you started," because that was the key, not stopping him, not confronting him, but allowing the process to continue under the weight of a truth he had not yet realized. Daniel's response came measured, controlled, the way it always did when something threatened his version of order. He said, "This is not the place for this," but Emily did not move, did not react, because she was not there to argue, she was there to confirm, and confirmation does not require permission. She simply placed the folder on a nearby table, not sliding it, not presenting it, just placing it where it could be seen, where it could exist within the same space as everything he believed to be final, and the simplicity of that action carried more weight than any raised voice could have. The officiant, standing nearby, hesitated only briefly before continuing. Because the expectation of the evening had not yet been formally disrupted, the guests watched, waiting, unsure of what they were witnessing but aware that it mattered, and Daniel, after a moment that stretched longer than he intended, turned back toward the ceremony, because control, to him, meant proceeding, completing, finalizing, and so he did. He took the pen, he signed where he was expected to sign, he completed the sequence he believed secured everything, and as he did, Emily remained exactly where she was, not moving forward, not stepping back, simply allowing the moment to reach its conclusion. Because only then did the timing align, only then did the structure lock into place in a way that could not be undone, and when the final signature was made, when the witnesses confirmed, when the assumption of completion settled over the room, that was when Emily stepped forward again, closing the distance just enough to shift the focus entirely, and she opened the folder, not with urgency, not with force, but with the same controlled precision that had defined every step leading to this moment, her voice steady, clear. She said, "You finalized the transfer exactly as intended, Daniel, but not in the way you think," and the words did not need explanation yet, because the presence of the documents alone began to change the air in the room, subtle at first, then unmistakable, as understanding moved from one person to the next, not all at once, but enough for the illusion to break. Enough for the certainty he had built to begin unraveling under the weight of something he had never fully examined, and for the first time that night, Daniel Whitmore was no longer controlling the outcome, he was reacting to it, and that shift, quiet as it was, marked the exact moment everything he believed to be secure started to move beyond his reach. Silence did not fall all at once, it settled slowly, like something heavy finding its place. And in that space between what had just been said and what had not yet been understood, every person in the room felt the shift even if they could not yet define it. Daniel's eyes moved from the documents to Emily, then back again. His mind working through possibilities, searching for the version of reality that still placed him in control, because that was what he had always relied on, the assumption that every outcome could be traced back to his decisions, his signatures, his authority. But this time the structure did not align, the pieces did not return to him in the way they were supposed to, and that was the first crack, not visible, not dramatic, but real. Emily did not rush to explain, she did not fill the silence with emotion, because she understood that truth does not need urgency, it needs space, and so she gave it that space. Allowing the room to catch up, allowing the presence of the documents to begin speaking for itself, the officiant stepped back instinctively, not out of instruction but out of awareness that something had shifted beyond the ceremony. Vanessa's expression changed again, sharper now, more focused, because she could feel the balance moving even if she did not yet understand the mechanics behind it, and Daniel finally spoke, his voice controlled but carrying an edge that had not been there before. He said, "What is this supposed to mean?" And Emily met his gaze without hesitation, her voice calm, steady. She said, "It means you completed every transfer exactly the way it was written, every clause, every approval, every signature, and that is why it matters, because for the first time that night, his own actions were no longer reinforcing his control, they were revealing its limits." She turned a single page within the folder, not quickly, not dramatically. Just enough for the contents to become visible to those closest to them, and the shift moved outward again, subtle, controlled, as recognition began to form in the expressions of those who understood what they were seeing, not everyone, not all at once, but enough for the certainty Daniel had relied on to begin dissolving under the weight of something he had never accounted for. Emily continued, her tone unchanged. She said, "You believed removing me from your life would remove me from everything connected to it. But that is not how structure works, not when it has already been built, not when the foundation includes elements you never chose to see." And the words were not an accusation, they were a statement, precise, undeniable, and that precision left no room for deflection, because this was not about intention, it was about execution, and Daniel had executed everything exactly as he intended, which was the problem. He had followed through without questioning, without verifying, without considering that the system he trusted might not function the way he assumed it did, and now that system existed in front of him, not as a concept, not as a risk, but as a reality he could not undo. The room remained quiet. Not because people were unsure, but because they were beginning to understand, and understanding changes the way silence feels. It becomes heavier, more defined, more final. Daniel stepped closer, his movements controlled but no longer effortless, because effort had entered the equation, and effort meant adjustment, something he was not accustomed to making in public. He looked at the documents again, then at Emily, and in that moment the certainty he had carried all night was no longer complete. It was fractured, just enough to show that control is not something you declare. It is something you maintain, and once it begins to shift, it does not return easily. Emily closed the folder then, not because she was finished, but because she did not need to continue. Everything that needed to be understood had already been placed in the room, everything that needed to change had already begun to move, and she stepped back, not retreating, not yielding, simply repositioning. Because this moment was no longer about her proving anything, it was about him realizing it, and realization cannot be forced, it happens when there are no more alternatives left to consider, and as the weight of that realization settled over the space, subtle but irreversible, Emily Carter stood exactly where she needed to be, not as someone who had come back for something she lost, but as someone who had allowed everything to reveal itself at the exact moment it could no longer be denied. And Daniel Whitmore, standing in the center of what he believed was his final act of control, understood for the first time that completion does not always mean ownership, and sometimes the moment you think everything is secured is the moment it moves beyond your reach entirely.